Hello, everybody. So this article came up in my sort of inbox, as it were, and I thought, wow, this is very, very interesting. I'm just going to share it with you, and you'll see what I mean. This is from Scientific American. And boy, oh boy, is it flawed. The field of firearms forensics is flawed. The matching of bullets to guns is subjective, and courts are starting to question it because of testimony from scientific experts. In 2003, Donald Kennedy, then editor-in-chief of the journal Science, wrote an editorial called Forensic Science, Oxymoron? Yes, he answered this question, in effect, yes. Unfortunately, the answer remains much the same today. Forensic experts continue to employ unproven techniques, and courts continue to accept their testimony largely unchecked. However, courts have recently begun to recognize the scientific limitations of one forensic field, firearms identification, in which an examiner visually compares fired bullets or cartridge cases and opines on whether the items were fired by the same gun. Contrary to its popular reputation, firearms identification is a field built largely on smoke and mirrors. Firearms examiners suffer from what might be called Sherlock Holmes syndrome. They claim they can match a cartridge case or bullet to a specific gun and thus solve a case. Science is not on their side, however. Few studies of firearms exist, and those that do indicate that examiners cannot reliably determine whether bullets or cartridges were fired by a particular gun. Firearms identification, like all purportedly scientific proof, must adhere to consistent and evidence-based standards. Fundamental justice requires no less. Absent such standards, the likelihood of convicting the innocent, and thus letting the guilty go free is too great. It is perhaps this realization that has led courts to slowly start taking notice and restrict firearms testimony. In the courts, firearms examiners present themselves as experts. Indeed, they do possess the expertise of a practitioner in the application of forensic techniques, such as a physician is a practitioner of medical tools, such as drugs or vaccines. But there is a key distinction between this form of expertise and that of a researcher who is professionally trained in experimental design, statistics, and the scientific method, who manipulates inputs and measures outputs to confirm that the techniques are valid. Both forms of expertise have value, but for different purposes. If you need a COVID vaccine, the nurse has the right form of expertise. By contrast, if you want to know whether the vaccine is effective, you don't ask the nurse, you ask research scientists who understand how it was created and tested. Unfortunately, courts have rarely heard testimony from classically trained research scientists who could verify claims made by firearms examiners and explain basic principles and methods of science. Only research scientists have the wherewithal to counter the claims of practitioner experts. What are needed are anti-expert experts. Such experts are now appearing more and more in courts across the country, and we count ourselves proudly among this group. Skepticism of firearms identification is not new. A 2009 National Research Council report criticized the firearms identification field as lacking a precisely defined process. Guidelines from the Association of Firearm and Toolmark Examiners allow examiners to declare a match between a bullet or cartridge case and a particular firearm when the unique surface contours of two tool marks are in sufficient agreement. According to the guidelines, sufficient agreement is the condition in which the comparison exceeds the best agreement demonstrated between two tool marks known to have been produced by different tools and is consistent with the agreement demonstrated by tool marks known to have been produced by the same tool. In other words, the criterion for a life-shaping decision is based not on a quantitative standards, but on the examiner's subjective experience. A 2016 report by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology echoed the NCR's conclusion that the firearms identification process is circular, and it described the sort of empirical studies required to test the validity of firearms identification. At the time, only one appropriately designed test had been completed, carried out by the Ames laboratory of the Department of Energy, colloquially called Ames-1. PCAST concluded that more than a single appropriately designed study was necessary to validate the field of firearm examination, and it called for additional studies to be conducted. The NCR and PCAST reports were attacked vigorously by firearms examiners. Although the reports per se had little impact on judicial rulings, they did inspire additional tests of firearms identification accuracy. These studies report amazingly low error rates, typically around 1% or less, which emboldens examiners to testify that their methodology is nearly infallible. But how these studies arrive at these error rates is dubious, and without anti-expert experts to explain why these studies are flawed, courts and juries can and have been bamboozled into accepting specious claims. It's very, very interesting. In fieldwork, firearms examiners generally reach one of three categorical conclusions. The bullets are from the same source, called identification, a different source called elimination, or inconclusive, which is used when the examiner feels the quality of the sample is insufficient for identification or elimination. While this I don't know category makes sense in fieldwork, the clandestine way it has been treated in validation studies and presented in court is flawed and seriously misleading. The problem arises in regard to how to classify an inconclusive response in the research. Unlike fieldwork, researchers studying firearms identification in laboratory settings create the bullets and cartridge cases to use in their studies. Hence, they know whether comparisons came from the same gun or a different gun. They know ground truth, like a true-false exam. There are only two answers in these research studies. I don't know or inconclusive is not one of them. I will wait to hear this. Existing studies, however, count inconclusive responses as correct, i.e. not errors, without any explanation or justification. These inconclusive responses have a huge impact on the reported error rates. In the Ames-1 study, for example, the researchers reported a false positive error rate of 1%. But here's how they got to that. Of the 2,178 comparisons they made between non-matching cartridge cases, 65% of the comparisons were correctly called eliminations. The other 34% of the comparisons were called inconclusive, but instead of keeping them as their own category, the researchers lumped them in with the eliminations, leaving 1% as what they called their false positive rate. If, however, those inconclusive responses are errors, then the error rate would be 35%. 7 years later, the Ames laboratory conducted another study known as Ames-2, using the same methodology, and reported false positive error rates for bullet and cartridge casing comparisons of less than 1%. Wait till you hear this. However, when calling inconclusive responses as incorrect instead of correct, the overall error rate skyrockets to 52%. But this is the best bit. The most telling findings came from subsequent phases of the AIMS2 study, in which researchers sent the same items, right, get this, sent the same items back to the same examiner to reevaluate, and then to different examiners to see whether results could be repeated by the same examiner or reproduced by another. The findings were shocking. The same examiner, looking at the same bullets a second time, reached the same conclusion only 2/3 of the time. Different examiners looking at the same bullets reached the same conclusion less than 1/3 of the time. So much for getting a second opinion. And yet firearms examiners continue to appear in court claiming that studies of firearms identification demonstrate an exceedingly low error rate. You've been caught out, forensics examiners. The English biologist Thomas Huxley famously said that science is nothing but trained and organized common sense. In most contexts, judges display an uncommon degree of common sense. However, when it comes to translating science for courtroom use, judges need the help of scientists. But this help must come not just in the form of scientific reports and published articles. Scientists are needed in the courtroom, and one way to do this is to serve as an anti-expert expert. There you go. Oh, wow. I like that. You know, they send the same stuff to the same exact, obviously not telling them that it's the same stuff that they've already tested, and they get a different answer. And then they send it to different examiners, and everybody's all over the shop, completely at loggerheads with one another. It's like the old bite mark analysis, isn't it? You know. So as I say, how do we know that item FL even came from the rifle that was above Stephen's bed? Bizarre. Anyway, not that this is the kind of evidence that will lead to a retrial for Steve, but hopefully they're starting to realize this situation and do something about it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that little article, and we'll catch you all soon. Bye for now.